Well, hey there and welcome back. So where we got to last week was we looked at the life of Jesus in the sense of his ministry. What was Jesus? What was his vocation? And what we see when we look at him is that he was both a teacher and a prophet. And so if you remember from the Old Testament, when you come across these prophets, you know, the guys like Isaiah and Elijah and Elisha and these guys, one of the primary role of the prophet was always to be God's spokesman to the people to say, hey, this is what God's saying. God is not happy. Generally, that's what the message was. God isn't happy with what you guys are doing, and just calling the people out for their failures to ultimately to adhere to Torah. God had laid out a covenant with his people, and he'd said, so long as we both uphold our ends of this agreement, of this covenant, we'll be okay. You'll be blessed. You'll be prosperous. Everything will go well for you. Again, so long as you maintain your end of the bargain, which is to be faithful to the covenant, to be faithful to the law that I've established for you. So that's how it was always meant to be throughout Israel's history and to be the people of God. But what they continually failed to do, as we saw, was to be faithful to that covenant, to be faithful to the law. And so the prophets would come along and say, hey, guys, what are you doing? Cut it out. And what that would typically look like is that they would call out the leaders. It wasn't necessarily the people who were just openly in revolt against God. It was the leaders who were leading them astray. The king was always there to be an exemplar, to show the people how to be the people of God and ultimately to lead them into being the people of God. Same with the priesthood. Their role was to enable or to show or to teach or lead the people to be the people of God. And so when they failed in that duty, the prophets would come along and call them out on it. And very often that would end badly for the prophets. They would often be killed or run out of town, or any type of torment or persecution would be visited on them because they were saying the things that people didn't want to hear. They didn't want to be told you're doing the wrong thing. They just wanted to carry on as they were. And so these prophets were just a pain in the you-know-what. They were just these pesky prophets that were just trying to spoil the party, just trying to be a pain in the backside. Well, anyway, that was always the role then of the prophet. And so when we see Jesus' ministry, both as a teacher and a prophet, in so many ways, what Jesus is doing is the same thing. Jesus is coming along and saying to the people, you're getting it wrong, and particularly calling out the leaders, particularly calling out the people who are in charge of this whole thing. And, well, calling it for what it is. You guys are getting it wrong. This is what's wrong with the people. It's not what you think it is. Actually, it's this thing over here. And so we've got to stop this. In fact, this is why I'm here. We're bringing a new kingdom here. There's a new covenant that's on its way. I'm inaugurating that. I'm starting a new way for God to deal with his people. And not everyone's going to be on board with that. In fact, many of you will reject it, and that's going to be to your detriment. But those that do see it, those that do recognize in me that God is at work in a new way, they're going to be blessed. And so it goes without saying then that Jesus is going to cause some problems, or he's going to be not received very well. And well, that's exactly what we see on the cross. What we see is Jesus, or the result of Jesus ultimately calling out the people in charge, calling out the authorities, looking after the people of God. And so this is where we're going to move towards in our final couple of episodes. You know, we're asking the question, what is that sign above Jesus's head, that this is the King of the Jews? And I guess you're starting to get a sense then of what it means to be the King of the Jews, and certainly what the expectation was. This long-awaited Messiah, Christos, who is at the same time a king. This is what we're waiting for. And so this is what the expectation around Jesus is now. Is Jesus the one? Is he the Messiah? Is he this one we've been waiting for all of this time? But there's question marks around that, or at least there's some doubts around that, because he doesn't do the things that we expect. Even John the Baptist, his cousin, at one point says, are you sure you're the one? We were expecting something else, and you're not quite what we expected. And so even the ones close to him, I mean, his own family, very famously said, we think this dude's out of his mind. James, his brother, was like, yeah, I think we should maybe keep you inside. His mum too. Maybe we should keep you inside. Maybe we should stop letting you go out in public, because when you go out in public, you're saying some stuff that's a little bit crazy. Maybe we just need to, just keep you out of public sight. Now, eventually James becomes the head of the church, and so that works. He eventually comes to realize, hey, my older brother did come back to life, and wow, okay, he must be God. But that's going to come later on. So even those closest to him didn't really recognize what he was. He wasn't what they were expecting. But along the way, what he certainly was doing was calling out the authorities. And this is really where the trouble begins, because as far as everybody was concerned, the authorities were the ones, well, certainly at least the teachers of the law, were the ones that were going to be first in on the resurrection. The resurrection is coming, that the God is going to resurrect his people, and those that are wicked are going to be raised up to judgment and eternal torment, whereas those who have been righteous will be raised up to an eternal reward. And so everybody just thinks amongst the righteous are going to be the teachers of the law, the ones that are practicing righteousness every day. These guys are the exemplars of what it means to be righteous. And yet these are the guys that Jesus is calling out and saying, you're the ones that are going to miss out on the kingdom precisely because of what you're doing, because your righteousness is, well, as we're going to see, is not all it appears to be. Well, anyway, that's a little bit of foreshadowing of what's to come. Jesus is going to be arrested and he's going to be tried for various reasons, but really what stem from this challenge that he brings, like the prophets of old, bringing the challenge to the authorities and the ones that are in charge. So before we get there, we're going to look today at some of the challenges that Jesus brings, but just by way of sort of a recap, I want to just reintroduce to you some of the key characters for the rest of our story. We're talking about Jesus, but Jesus only makes sense in the context of those around him. So if this was a play, this is kind of the opening scene where we're just introduced to who the main characters in the play are going to be. So some of these we've already met, some of them I've talked about over the past few weeks, but just again, by way of reminder, just to sort of bring them all into the story. And I've spent a lot of time introducing these characters for the reason that we need to really understand them in their historical context. Why do they emerge? Who are these people? Where did they come from? That's an important question to answer, because when you pick up your Gospels, particularly coming from the Old Testament, you pick up the Gospels, and there's all these characters in there that you go, where do these guys come from? Who are these people and why are they so important? Again, particularly the Pharisees. Who are these guys? Where do they come from? And why does everybody seem to listen to these guys? Why do they seem to have so much authority in the land? Well, again, this is what we need to sort of tell the backstory of them. And then for the purposes of the next couple of episodes, just a quick reminder of who these guys were. So our two primary groups that we meet are the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And if you remember where they came from was during the Hasmonean period, where we've got, for a century, some actual Jewish kings, people from the people of God, who had taken control back over Israel, and they sort of restored a lot of the land. They'd recaptured a lot of the land. And so from Judas Maccabeus and down the line, from his family down, what we have are a series of Jewish kings who are, well, ostensibly Jewish kings. This is what we thought we were waiting for, was to have these Jewish kings. As it turns out, they were very Hellenistic. They were very much still thinking and acting and very much influenced by the surrounding Greek culture, which is exactly what we were rebelling against in the first place. The whole reason we had this uprising was to overthrow this Greek tyranny that was on us, and now the very leaders that we put into place are now bringing back the same thing. So what's actually changed? And so it's in response to that we get these new movements emerging, particularly the Pharisees, who, as the name itself means, are separatists. They're going, you know what, if the leaders aren't going to do it, we're going to do it. We're going to be the ones going to show the people how to be the people of God. And so what we saw in the Pharisees is that they strongly opposed this Hellenism. This is one of their primary characteristics, is that they opposed everything pagan. They opposed everything, every foreign influence, like the zealous characters of the Old Testament like Phinehas back in Exodus, who goes and, on behalf of Moses, goes and slaughters all of these men who've gone and married these Midianite women back when they're out in the desert. And so they've sort of taken their lead from people like that who are standing up for what it means to be the people of God, who are taking a stand and really just living out the life as it's meant to be, even in the face of opposition from those around. And so that's kind of at the core of the Pharisaic identity. But what we also saw with these guys is that they had not just cultural influence, they weren't just respected amongst the people as being very righteous, but they also held political power as well. They were typically going to be very highly educated. To be highly educated, you need to be very wealthy. And so by that fact alone, they're going to hold both cultural influence, but also political, economic, social influence as well. So these are very powerful people. And as we see, they hold positions of authority within the ruling body, which is the Sanhedrin, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Now, the thing with the Pharisees is that they have Torah and there's a very strict observance of Torah, but more than that, they want to make sure that they don't make any mistakes again, which is what the problem was in the first place. We had the law, we ignored it. Now we're not just going to ignore the law, but we're going to explore it to the nth degree. And what emerges out of this is this oral tradition, this tradition of, well, we've got the law, but what does it mean to not work on the Sabbath? Well, there's all of these other restrictions, or all of these other contingencies, or other expansions of that basic law, which defines what work is. And so you do any of these things, that's a violation of Sabbath. That's what it means to not work on the Sabbath. And so this oral tradition becomes seemingly so important, maybe even more important than the law itself. This oral tradition that gets passed down and ultimately written down later on in books like the Mishnah, this becomes really what is at the core of what it means to be a Pharisee. It's the memorizing, it's the understanding, and then obviously the living out of this oral tradition. And then so along with that, a very strict focus on purity, and again, all of the things that is just what makes the people of God. This is what they're strictly focused on. Alongside of them, you have the Sadducees. And now we don't know as much about the Sadducees, but what we do know is that they were very politically powerful people. And really that's what the point was. They were more pragmatic, more political than they were necessarily religious. And so their concern, that as wealthy landowners as they typically were, their concern was much more related to their own interests, their own economic interests. So they weren't as opposed to Hellenism. If that's the way that the world is going, then we're going to accept some Hellenism as much as is appropriate in order to maintain our political and economic positions, to maintain our connections with really who are still the ruling power, which is the Greeks that are around us. And so they're not totally opposed to Hellenism. And in terms of their righteousness, they reject everything that the Pharisees are doing, which is all of these oral traditions. Their idea is, no, look, we've got the 10 Commandments, that's all we need, right? We've got simple scripture, and anything beyond that is just rules of man. We don't need any of that stuff. We just stick to the bare minimum of what God requires, and then for the rest of it, it's more about pursuing our own interests. So these are our cultural leaders within the Jewish world, and certainly within the world in the area of Judea. And so naturally, these are the ones that Jesus is going to oppose because, well, those are the ones who are showing or teaching the people how to be the people of God. They're the teachers of the law who are meant to be the exemplars of all of this. Now, another key character that we've already met on several occasions is Herod Antipas. So if you remember, Galilee, where Jesus comes from, is a completely different region. Judea is its own region. It's a Roman province. Galilee is a separate province to that. Now, it's the same in that it's all Jewish people, right? They're all the same people. They're probably family members who live in both in both provinces. But Galilee itself was ruled separately from Roman authority. If you remember, when Herod the Great died, his sons were given control by Augustus of what was Herod's overall territory. And so that was all divided up. And so Galilee was given to Herod Antipas. And so he becomes a client king. He's working on behalf of the Romans. Obviously, he has power only because the Romans keep him in power. And so his job on behalf of the Romans is keep the peace, collect the taxes. But he's effectively autonomous apart from that. He has pretty much his own capacity to rule. Again, so long as he just keeps the taxes flowing back to Rome, everything is going to be okay. So that's a different region. And so Jesus coming from there, it's important for us as we go forward in the story, Jesus being a Galilean is under the direct authority of Herod Antipas, not of the rulers of Judea. So even when Jesus is in Jerusalem later on and in Judea, he's not answerable to those authorities in the sense that those are his direct rule. That's always going to be Herod Antipas. But, well, anyway, we'll see how that plays out with the rest of the story. Now, because this is his territory, because Herod Antipas is the one who is there on behalf of the Romans, but it's his territory, he has his own authority, jurisdiction over the law, over the legal system there. And so what we don't find in Galilee is a Roman presence. That's an important point. We don't see Romans really at all throughout Galilee. We don't meet them until we get to Judea later on. Judea is now a direct Roman-controlled region, and so you have a much stronger presence of Roman military forces within that. And over all of that is our other key character that we met last week, which is Pontius Pilate. Now, the funny thing with Pilate is that he was just one of many hundreds, if not thousands, of governors who ruled the multiple regions of the Roman world throughout its history. He was, in any other context, he would have just been a nobody. We never would have known him apart from one brief reference that we actually have to him, one sort of piece of archaeological evidence that we have of him, which is this small inscription actually in Caesarea Maritima. So actually, let me just back the story up a little bit. So the reason why we have Pontius Pilate in the first place is because in 6 AD, if you remember, you had the other Jewish king of Judea, Herod Archelaus, so the brother of Herod Antipas. Herod Archelaus was basically driven out by his own people. They appealed to Rome. He was so bad that they appealed to Rome and they drove him out. And so the Romans were like, that's fine, we'll take direct control over the province. We'll make that a Roman province. You'll be directly answerable to effectively the emperor, but through his proxies. And that's how things are going to be from now on. What that means is that it's a total change in the ruling structure. So what we're going to have instead is that we're going to have governors. We're going to have procurators over the region. Now, what typically happens with Rome is that you have governors of the various Roman provinces. That's a standard sort of feature. And so we meet guys like Gallio, for example, in Corinth. So he's a standard Roman governor. The way that you become a governor is that you need to, first of all, have been in the Senate. You need to have been what we call of senatorial rank, so the highest rank that you could hold in the Roman world. And having served in the Roman government, you get appointed to a position as a governor. Now, basically, that means that you're just sent out to a region to rule it for 12 months or a couple of years, and it's kind of like superannuation. You've spent a lot of time in Rome. You've served the Roman people. Well, you've served yourself, but on behalf of the Roman people. And to pursue your political interests, that's cost you a lot of money. To get to the highest offices of consul, that's cost a lot of money. You've had to pay a lot of bribes. You've got to pay for a lot of election campaigns. Really, there's a lot that you've had to invest into getting this high position. And so the goal then after that is to become a governor of a region. And really what this is an opportunity to make your money back, really. Yes, you're the governor of the region, but really what you're there to do is to get your money back. And the way you're going to do that is through tax collection, because your job, of course, is to keep the peace and collect the taxes. So those taxes are going to be sort of come through you and go back to Rome. And the way that the taxes are collected is that we take a census of the region. We count up how many tax-paying people there are, how much tax we can expect to gather from this region over the next 6 years, and then we set about getting that. And the way that will typically work is that the governor will say to the wealthiest people in the region, all right, this is how much tax your region owes. Who wants to buy the contract? And so let's just say, for example, it's 1 million sesterces at a low number of tax that this region is going to owe. Okay, so that's how much we've calculated that you guys owe us. Who wants the job? And so people would bid for the job. And so you'll see someone say, well, I'll give you the million. Someone else says, I'll give you 1.1. Another will say, I'll give you 1.2. And there's a bidding war for who's going to get the tax collecting. And so eventually you land on the highest bidder, and that person gets the job. And you go, hang on a second, how is this of any benefit to the person who's just paid up all this money? Well, first of all, it's a benefit to the governor because he's only got to collect 1 million. So he sends the 1 million back to Rome and keeps the 0.3 for himself. But then the person who's collected the taxes, who's paid for the taxes, now has to go and collect them back. And so he's not going to just collect back 1.3. He's going to collect maybe 1.5 through all of the various means of tax collection. And so basically the guy at the bottom is the one who's getting absolutely screwed over here because, well, they're the ones that ultimately have to pay for all of this corruption. So this is why tax collectors have never been popular and certainly weren't popular back in the first century, back in ancient Rome. But that's effectively how it works. And so the governors of these regions, that's one of their primary functions is to collect the taxes, but then also within that to get very rich as a result. So that's a typical governor. But what we get in Judea is a little bit different. Because Judea is such a volatile area, what we don't need is some fat, pampered Roman governor Roman senator who, if he did fight in a war, was decades ago, who was basically just there to enrich himself. That's not going to be very effective. What we need in a place like Judea is somebody much more militaristic. This is a region of the empire that really nobody wants anything to do with because the Jewish people are just such a pain in the butt. Wherever you find Jewish people, they're always contrarian. They always do it their own way. They will refuse to toe the line really with anything to do with the Roman world. And that's going to be even worse when you get to Judea itself, where you've got that very heartland of the Jewish people and the temple itself, right? You're going into the very heart, the very core of Judaism. You're not going to get very tolerant, very, accommodating people down there. And so if you're going to rule those people, you need to go down there with some military force. And what we find when we get to Judea is that you've got exactly that. You've got Roman forces precisely for this region, for this reason. Now, again, go to other regions where you meet these governors. Think about when Paul travels through Greece. As he's going through Acts, he's traveling through Asia Minor and through Greece. He doesn't meet any Romans. You don't get Roman forces in those places because you don't need them, because those places are at peace. Those people have accepted Roman rule and have done for a long time. The Jews never have, and they never will. And so you're always going to need to have a military presence and somebody who can command the troops in order to take care of that place. So the type of governor we get is more of directly from the military. Now, like all the governors, he's there on the emperor's behest. He's there because the emperor has given him that position. And so his position is only tenable so long as he's got the imperial favor. Again, that's very important that we're going to see later on. His role is, again, only made viable because of that reason. And so in the case of Jesus, the time of Jesus' birth was under the Emperor Augustus. When we come to Jesus' adult life, we're looking at the Emperor Tiberius. And so Tiberius was in direct control of the Roman world, of course, but he was the one who was the patron of Pontius Pilate during his reign. So Pilate is our fifth governor. Since 6 AD, we've had 5 governors, the fifth of those being Pontius Pilate. And coming back to the point I made before, one of the few pieces of evidence that we have for his existence, apart from some literary references in guys like Josephus, but we've actually got an inscription which has the name Pontius Pilate on there. So in a place called Caesarea Maritima. So Caesarea, if you remember, Caesarea is the capital of the region of Judea. That's a city built by Herod the Great, just specifically to house the Romans. It's a coastal city built by the Jewish king, but named after Caesar Augustus, as a Roman base of operations in the region. And so that's the place of Roman presence there. So whenever you're dealing with Romans, that's where you're going to go. So Pontius Pilate lives in Caesarea Maritima. He doesn't live in Jerusalem. So when we see him down there later on, that's not because he lives there. He's just there for a particular reason at that time. He's normally in Caesarea, and you can still go there today. I was there not that long ago. You can go walk through his palace. It's just an extraordinary place that, well, it's only the foundation of it now, but you can get a sense of how extraordinary this palace of his was, right on the water, beautiful ocean views. Really, it really is an extraordinary city. But what we actually find there is this inscription, and it's got Pontius Pilate's name on there. Now, the one that's on display on the site is just a mock-up. It's a copy of the original, because the original is obviously very valuable. We're going to keep that stored away. But where it was found, what you've got there now is actually a copy of it, or it's the copy of the inscription which has his name there. So you can actually Google it, look it up if you want, and just have an idea of what that thing looks like. But anyway, so Pontius Pilate really probably would have otherwise been just a bit of a no-name. He would have been mentioned maybe a little bit in Josephus, but not really with any of the same prominence that he has. But because he happened to be the guy that was ruling when Jesus was doing his ministry, he's going to go down in infamy as probably the most famous Roman governor that there ever was, when in fact he was actually kind of a second or third tier level run-of-the-mill Roman governor who just had the unlucky fortune of being assigned that particular position at that particular time. Well, anyway, Pilate did have a bit of a reputation. When he first arrived in Jerusalem, when he first arrived in the region, what a governor will always do is they'll go and they'll do a circuit of the region. And one of the primary roles of the governor is to decide capital cases. Only the governor has the power of life and death. That's one of the things the Romans take away from the people, is that power of capital punishment, of power of life and death. So only the governor has that. And so what will typically happen is that somebody who's been charged with a capital crime will be arrested, and they'll be put in sort of a prison of sorts and held there until they can have a trial. And the only person who can do that trial is the governor. So the first thing that a governor will do is that they'll drop their bags in the capital city, and then they'll jump into a carriage and they'll be taken around to all of the main cities, and they'll adjudicate over these trials. And so that's a standard sort of feature of being the governor. It's one of the jobs of keeping the peace. Apart from collecting taxes, you've got to keep the peace, and this is one of the ways that you do that. So when Pilate first arrived in Judea, he does one of these tours, and the first place you're going to go is to where the current or the local authorities are. And in this case, that's down in Jerusalem. Now, it's very, very important for your job as the governor is to have the local authorities on your side. Absolutely essential. You've just got to have those people at least liking you if they're going to be of any service. Otherwise, they're just going to be an absolute nightmare. You want to make sure that those guys are there in your service. And so he goes down to Jerusalem. The thing with Pilate is that he's a military man, right? He's not a diplomat. He's not a guy who is, he hasn't sort of got the political background that some of the other guys do. Being a military man, he's going to go in there and he's going to exercise force. He's going to go down and make the point that you don't mess with Rome. Right, I'm here. I'm not going to be somebody who's going to be screwed with. And so what he does is that he goes down into Jerusalem, and through the night, he establishes military standards. Now, the standards, as you know, are the big symbols that the armies would carry into battle. So you've seen the pictures of these ones with the long staffs, and on the top of them is usually an eagle or some sort of symbol that the army can rally to. So if we're in the middle of a battle and all the army's getting scattered, we put this up and everybody can see where the general is, and we can come back and we can reform around our leaders. Now, the thing about those standards is, number one, they represent Roman military might, but they also typically represent a god. They represent paganism. And so to go into Jerusalem, and Jerusalem, the Jews had a lot of exemptions, really just to help keep peace with them. And so one of the exemptions was that they don't have any sort of military or Roman symbolism particularly in their capital. Well, Pilate's like, "Nut, to hell with that. I'm gonna show these people that I'm in charge here. There's a new sheriff in town." So he goes and sets up these military standards. And when they come out the next morning, all the Jewish authorities come out the next morning, they see this and they absolutely lose it. And so they go to Pilate and they say, "Hey man, you got to pull this crap down." So they go all the way to Caesarea to make this case. And he's like, "No, I'm not going to do it." Anyway, eventually it's becoming a standoff, a real game of chicken. And he starts to threaten them, like, "Get out or else I'm going to kill you." And they're like, "All right, fine." And so they all kneel down and they expose their necks. In other words, to say, "Cut our heads off." And how's that going to look for you on your first week of the job? How's that going to look back in Rome when the emperor finds out that on the very first week of your job, you're killing all the local authorities? That's not going to end well for you, certainly. And so he backs down, he has the standards removed, and all seems to go back to peace. But really what he's doing up front is showing that this is not a guy that we can really easily work with. He's already got that reputation now as somebody who is very contrarian to the local population. Now, another thing that he does during his rule, now he rules for 10 years, which is not normal. Usually it's only 1 or 2 years that these governors rule, and they always go sort of on a rotation. He rules for 10 years. Again, it's a different type of rule that he has. And so he rules from 26 to 36. So right during Jesus' sort of adult life and certainly up beyond his death, his crucifixion, and then into the early years of the church. So he's there for a long period. And so a lot happens during his reign. And a couple of these stories that stand out, the one we just talked about. But another thing that happens is that he takes funds from the temple to build an aqueduct, which is kind of a bittersweet thing. On the one hand, an aqueduct is good because it means we get fresh water into Jerusalem. And so he's doing this for the people, right? We're building this great Roman technology, this aqueduct. We're bringing fresh water into the city, but we're using God's money to do it. And so in a sense you go, well, hang on, does it matter where the money's coming from? We've got good infrastructure. This is going to be good for all of us. But no, it's the fact that you're taking the money from the temple that is the problem. So it doesn't matter what you're doing with it. That's God's money. You took that from him to do this thing. And so again, the Jewish people, they protest. And to try to deal with this protest, Pilate sends some of his troops amongst the people dressed as civilians and has some of these protesters killed. And so that scatters the crowd, but of course it really adds to the stigma, it adds to the reputation that Pilate has as somebody who is this is not a good guy. This is not the sort of ruler that we've been looking for. And then one final thing, and it's like this guy doesn't learn his lesson. What you actually have in Jerusalem is a residence for the governor. And we're going to see this later on, but when Pilate does come to Jerusalem, when the governors do come to Jerusalem for reasons that we'll see, they have their own residence there, right next to the temple. And so normally they live in Caesarea, but when they do have to come to Jerusalem for the festivals particularly, they need a place to stay. And so they have their own residence down there, and that residence will house a military troop, so they'll have maybe a few thousand troops along with them. So it's a large residence they have, and all of this built by Herod. Herod the Great builds the temple, and he also builds next to the temple this fortress of Antonia, which is literally there to house the Roman governor. Well, anyway, he goes down and he decorates this with Roman shields. And on these shields, you've got the name of the emperor, who is a god, and all of the idolatry and blasphemy and paganism that comes along with that. And so he's using that to decorate a part of the temple, at least sort of an offshoot of the temple. So again, this is altogether bad form. This is not how you win over and influence people. Well, anyway, again, the Jewish people protest directly to Pilate, and he's like, nah, not going to have anything to do with it, completely ignores it. So they go all the way to Tiberius. They go to his patron in Rome and they say, hey man, this is what your guy back in Jerusalem is doing. So Tiberius, who's got much more political savvy than Pilate clearly does, he says to Pilate, dude, take those things down. This is not going to end well. So he has to do it naturally because his boss has just told him, hey man, you've stepped over the line here. But what we've got is a guy who is just not a popular guy. He is somebody who is trying to exert his authority and doing it in ways that is just putting the people so far offside that, well, as we're going to see, the story of Pilate doesn't go very well. So then our other key character, well, it's not a character so much as it's an organization. So the other factor of our story is the Sanhedrin. So when Jesus is arrested later on, he's brought before the Sanhedrin. Now, who are the Sanhedrin? Well, that's the ruling body of the Jewish people within Judea. So they work directly for the governor. They work directly for Pilate. So basically they act on his behalf. Now, the Sanhedrin is made up of 71 people. And the reason for 71 is because going back to Moses, when he was just getting overwhelmed with all of the work, his father-in-law comes along and says, dude, you got to appoint people. So he appoints 70 elders to help to deal with the many issues that have been brought to him by the people. And so you've got 70 elders plus Moses makes 71. So we've got 71 people in the Sanhedrin. Now, there was two types of Sanhedrin. There's the greater Sanhedrin, which is in Jerusalem, and that consists of the 71. So that's kind of like the Supreme Court of a country. That's the highest court in the land. And then in the different regions, you've also got lesser Sanhedrins, which are made up of 23 members. So these are they deal with local disputes. They deal with the local population. But if they can't deal with something, it's too big for them to deal with, or people want to appeal to the higher court, they go down to the greater Sanhedrin. So this is based in Jerusalem, within the temple grounds. So the Sanhedrin then are the ones who are doing the ruling of the people. They look after everything that is going on. And again, on behalf of Rome. So what is good, and the way that the Romans tend to run their regions is that they let the local people do the work, right? They don't want to step in there and say, all right, we're going to take over and you're going to have Romans to answer to now. As much as possible, you want the local authorities to do the work because, it means that you've got less bureaucracy. It means that you're not the one having to do all the work, but it also means that you're not the face of decisions that are made. So if it comes to a capital case, well, that's when the governor can step in, but for everything else, we'll leave it to you to work out. And we're very happy for that to happen. And so when we see later on, the Sanhedrin are trying Jesus. They've brought him to trial and they're the ones that are convicting him. But when they come to Pilate, they say, hey, yeah, but we can't kill him. And that's really what the point was. We can't be the ones to execute him. Only you can do that. And so that's why we've brought him to you. Now, overseeing all of this, and there's one more character that we haven't met yet, is the actual high priest. And at the time of Jesus's trial was a guy by the name of Joseph ben Caiaphas. So now he's the son-in-law of one of the previous high priests. So Annas was the high priest who was appointed when Rome took over. So going back to 6 AD, when Rome took over, they appointed Annas, and then his son-in-law eventually gets the position later on. So there's already some nepotism going on there. Now, remembering all of this too, if you remember in the Old Testament, the high priest always comes from the line of Aaron and was always, so therefore appointed from God's people, appointed because of the tribe that God had appointed. And so it has that sort of holy status about them. These are God's people chosen by God. What we've got now are high priests that have been appointed by the pagan authorities. So Caiaphas is in position. He'd been put into position as the high priest back in 18 AD under the governor of the time, a man named Valerius Gratus. So Gratus was the fourth governor of the since governors have been put in place. He was the one who preceded Pilate, and so he's the one who appointed Caiaphas to that position. So how does Caiaphas get into that position? Well, one, because he comes from a rich family, he's an influential person, and so basically you can assume there's going to be a bit of bribery that goes along with being appointed to that role. And he's a power-hungry person, but he's somebody who can be trusted by the Romans to take care of things, basically to be the governor in place of a Roman governor. The high priest effectively has replaced the role of the king. If you remember, King Herod was the last one to be done away with, and then, Herod Archelaus has been done away with. Now we don't have kings, at least in Judea, and so that role is going to go back to the high priest, which is always what the point was when the Jewish people called back and they said to the Romans, get rid of our king, we want to have a Roman rule. It's going back to the time when they were ruled by the Persians and the Greeks. The Persians and the Greeks didn't allow them to have a king. They had a king already. That was the Persian king or that was the Greek king. What they had instead was a high priest. The high priest was the one who acts on behalf of the people, but also acts on behalf of the king. And so the high priest is the ruler of the people. Now, why the Jewish people wanted that was that it kind of created the separation between them and Rome. So Rome isn't directly ruling over the Jewish people. Now we've got the high priest who's doing that for us, working on behalf of Rome, who are all the way back in Rome, right? Rome isn't localized. They're all the emperor is all the way back in Rome. And so that creates a bit of a separation between us. So the high priest then is functioning in that capacity, but he's appointed by the Romans. And they want their own man in the role. They want somebody that they know that they can trust, somebody who is loyal to them over the people. And so his role is really to do the work of keeping the peace, collecting the taxes. That's what the job of the high priest is now. It's not to be an exemplar and a spokesman for Yahweh. That's not what the role is because, well, Yahweh's not the king. The king is the emperor. And so the job of the high priest is to do the bidding of Rome. And so no one trusts this guy. The Jewish people aren't looking at this guy going, oh, he's a great person that we can look to and follow after. No, he's just a Roman puppet, the same way that Herod was and everyone before him. He's just another Roman puppet. This is all he is. But for Rome, he's a very important person. He's the one who's actually ultimately doing the work for them. So then his job, his position is to oversee the Sanhedrin. That's his job. So the Sanhedrin are the ruling body. He's the king, and so therefore he oversees them and takes care of all of those matters. So those are our cast of people within this story. And where we're going to move this towards then is how does Jesus confront them? What are the ways that he challenges them? So we'll finish off this video, this podcast with some of that, and we'll pick it up again next week. But Jesus, again, being a teacher, being a prophet, on both of those fronts, he's presenting a challenge to these ruling authorities, remembering particularly that the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, are also the ones in the Sanhedrin. So this Sanhedrin, this ruling body, is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. And so the teachers of the law are, at the same time, teachers of righteousness, exemplars of Torah, but then also the political authorities. They are the ones who are in charge of the people. They are the ones who are ultimately doing Rome's bidding in some sense, but ultimately the ones trying to keep the people in line too. And really now, look, to try to be generous towards the high priest, generous towards the Sanhedrin, they are in a tough position. On the one side, they've got very unruly people that don't want the Romans there. And on the other side, they've got Romans who are there. And they've got Romans who deal with matters through crosses. And what they have to maintain is this very tenuous balance between total chaos and somewhat peace and order. The way the peace and order is maintained is to keep the Romans happy and to keep the people in line enough, but without oppressing them so much that the people rebel. So it's a really tough line to have to walk. And so I don't have a lot of sympathy for them, but certainly it is a tough gig that they have to deal with here. They want to keep the people, because if the people do start to become unrestful, if the people do start becoming, started to push back against Rome, Rome isn't just going to come in and replace the Sanhedrin. They're going to start to crucify the people. They're going to make an example of the people who are doing this. Then they're going to deal with the Sanhedrin, which allowed this thing to happen in the first place. So keeping the peace in a place like Judea is a very, very, very difficult job. And so it's not an envious job by any stretch, but yet this is what they have to do. So when you get a teacher like Jesus coming along, who is a popularist teacher, people are turning out to see this guy, this is going to be a problem. He is stirring up the people. He literally is bringing all these great crowds out, and they're turning up to hear him because he's saying great things and he might be the Messiah, and he's performing miracles and he's doing all of these great things. And so the questions that have been asked are, is this the one? And if he is the one, well, that is a direct challenge to the authorities, the Sanhedrin who are actually in place, and particularly to the high priest. His role is being threatened by this Jesus character, because if the people decide to make Jesus the king by force, for example, that's a direct threat to him. And so if that's the case, there's going to be an uprising. That's going to bring the Romans into play, and all of this is going to go to hell very, very quickly. So just by virtue of Jesus' popularity amongst the people, already he presents a threat. Already he's marked out as somebody we need to keep an eye on, both in Judea, but we also find in Galilee as well, where Herod Antipas is also sending out his spies and just keep and monitoring Jesus, because the Galileans like Jesus as well, right? They think he's great too. And if they think that he's the king, they're going to come after Herod Antipas, and that's going to mean that he's going to lose his position and the Romans are going to come in and they're going to take over, and all of it's going to go really, really badly. So Jesus is a threat to the authorities just by being there in the first place, just by being popular. He himself is already something of a direct threat to those authorities, and so naturally they're going to be at least suspicious about him, but they're going to be doing their very best to try to bring him down. And this is exactly what we see. Because the question of Jesus' teaching is this the Messiah? He's teaching, he's clearly a teacher of the law. He's clearly somebody who is teaching us the ways of God, teaching us how to be the people of God. That's the job of the Messiah. Is he the one? And so the way that you're going to undermine that, the way that you're going to try to discredit that, is to challenge him on his teaching. And so the constant arguments that Jesus gets into are with the teachers of the law, who are at the same time the authorities, who are being threatened by Jesus' teaching, Jesus' actions. And so they constantly sort of arguing and challenging him in public debates, trying to undermine him, trying to show him to be a charlatan and a fraud and all the rest of it. And in a way, Jesus isn't really helping himself, right? And for reasons we'll see now, but also next week, Jesus doesn't make this easy for himself in the way that he goes about his teaching. So I want to take just sort of one example here of a very famous statement that Jesus makes, just to show you how this really was a problem, how really it was a threat to what these guys are doing. So it's from Matthew 5:27. It's from the Sermon on the Mount. So you'd be familiar with it, but I'll read it out anyway. It says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So there are several problems here, several threats that this teaching poses for the Jewish people, and certainly for the teachers of the law. Number one, Jesus starts off with saying, you have heard it said, but then he counteracts that by saying, but I say to you. Now, there's several things that are going on here. First of all, you've heard it said. Well, by who? Well, by your teachers, by the teachers of the law, by these Pharisees, and Pharisees who would have been right there. People, they would have been in the audience listening to this. They definitely would have been checking out this sermon. So he's directly calling them out for the things that they've said and teaching things that seem perfectly fine, right? Don't commit adultery. That makes perfect sense. And so Jesus is saying, you've heard it said, but what he's also doing is that he's citing a way of teaching that is standard amongst the Jewish people. When you're a teacher, you don't just teach on your own authority, you teach on the authority of somebody else. And so, the teachers will say, according to this great rabbi from a previous generation, and then you cite that authority and then you state what that teacher says. So this isn't me saying this. This is this great person who's been established as a famous, illustrious or authoritative teacher. You cite that person and that their authority carries through your words. And so the people are going to listen, not because I said it, because this guy said it. Now, you deal with this in the academic world all the time, right? If I'm writing a paper or a book or something, you don't just go and say, well, here are a bunch of my opinions. No, everything has to be cited. Everything has to be footnoted, and you have to be backed up by other scholars who've proven that this is true. And so what you're doing with your research is that you're bringing together these verified ideas, these peer-reviewed ideas, and you're sort of collating them into your own assertion. That's what the Jewish teachers are doing. They're calling on this previous authority to establish their own authority in teaching what they're doing. So it's both calling out what the teachers of the law have said and at the same time calling out a way of teaching which is the accepted way or the expected way of teaching. Jesus comes along and he says, but I say to you. In other words, I'm standing on my own authority. Well, who does that? right? No self-respecting Jewish teacher stands on their own authority unless they're saying something more about themselves than maybe what meets the eye. What are you saying about yourself here, Jesus? What makes you so authoritative? Where does your authority come from to say this? Because the only authority apart from these other great teachers of previous generations is God himself, right? Is that what you're saying here, Jesus? Are you saying that you're God? Are you saying that you're drawing directly from his authority? That's not just a bold statement. That's a blasphemous statement. That's apostasy right there. You don't say that. You don't stand on your own authority unless you are claiming to be at least under God's authority, but maybe even saying to God yourself. So this is a problem. This is a direct threat then, or a challenge to the established authoritative teachers of the law. But look at what else he also says. He says that if you look at a woman, he says, you've heard it said you should not commit adultery, which is true. That's what the command says. Jesus comes along and he's saying here, but if you even look at a woman lustfully, then you've committed adultery with her in your heart. That's a game changer. Because the teachers of the law are saying, here's the standard. Jesus is saying, no, I'm going to push back on that standard. It's not just about doing the act, but it's even thinking about it. Now, the minute you say thinking about it, everybody's guilty. Everybody is guilty of doing that thing, and everybody now becomes a sinner. Now, these teachers of the law stand on their own righteousness and say, I've never committed adultery. I'm a righteous person. I would never do that. But if you're saying that the standard is even to think about it, well, now we're all guilty. Now we're all sinful. And so whatever authority, whatever righteous or religious authority these teachers had is now being undermined because they're down now righteously at the same level as everybody that they're trying to lead. So this is undermining them, but it's also setting a standard of holiness that we can't achieve. The covenant was clear. Don't do these things, do these things, do them and don't do them, and you will be part of the covenant. It's a behavioral thing. It's this, your actions are really a determiner of whether you're in or you're out. And so that's why the teachers of the law, when they expand on all of these commands, they create more and more sets of behavior, things that we have to do, particular actions that make us righteous. And so do these things, whether you want to or not, do these things and you'll be part of the people of God. You won't lose your place within the covenant. Jesus is saying, I'm going to push that further and say, even if you have to think about it, you have to want this. You have to act, not just act, but your actions have to come from a place of desire. You have to change your very desires. And so what Jesus is setting about is a standard that is impossible for all humans to ever attain to, which is exactly the point. We can't do this ourselves. And so this new kingdom, this new covenant that Jesus is establishing is something that a righteous teacher of the law, even that great person, can't attain to. It's impossible for even the best teacher of the law to never think a lustful thought. And so even those people are going to be disqualified from this new kingdom unless they come at it from a different way, unless they come at it from a place of humility, from a place of humbleness, from a place of being able to first admit that we can't do this ourselves. And so what Jesus is doing is setting about a new way of doing the people of God, which invites everybody but excludes everybody at the same time unless you come into this with a humble heart, with a heart that's seeking to be transformed by God, which is what the new covenant is going to be about. And so already, just from little statements like this, early on in Jesus' ministry, we can already see that he's a direct threat to the righteous, authoritative teachers, the ones who hold cultural influence, but also political influence as well. So he's undermining them right from the get-go. And as his ministry carries on over the next couple of years, this is going to only be exaggerated. This is only going to be heightened until, well, the fateful event when Jesus is ultimately arrested and crucified. But anyway, we'll pick up that story next week. In the meantime, I hope you have a fantastic week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.